We've been talking quite a bit in class about how there are certain expectations for how figures are shown in Egyptian art. We've talked a lot about the canon of proportions based on the grid system. We've talked a lot about idealized figures with very little emotion or movement. And even though they are kind of generic, they're still shown in a very flattering light. Well, here with Seated Scribe, I'm going to show you something that is actually very different from that. And the reason it is different is that this is done for someone who has a lower class than some of the other examples we've seen in class. As a scribe, he definitely would have had a higher class status than most people. He obviously had enough money to have his own tomb. He paid for this work. We don't know exactly who he is, but that shows he has some wealth. At the same time, he definitely does not have as much wealth or as much status as someone who would have been closely aligned with the royal family or a very high-ranking priest. And those are the types of patrons who've paid for most of the other artworks that we've seen so far. So when we get those royal or very high-ranking priest class types of patrons, we see an adherence to all of those expectations for the figure. When we see, however, like with Seated Scribe, someone who has a little less social status paying for a work of art, we see something that is less rigid, something that's less traditional, and even is done in a less durable medium. So let's take a look at some of these differences in more detail. So as this image pans down, we can see that this artwork is really kind of stepping slightly away from some of the expectations in contrast to the others. First thing that you might notice is that he's not an idealized figure. We've got a little bit of softness to the midsection on the figure here, rather than having that really trim, narrow waist that the Egyptians appreciated. We also can see something that's a big difference, and that is the lack of the engaged limbs. That's a huge step away from some of the other things that we have seen. One thing that we see too that is different is that he is having a very different kind of pose, right? He's sitting down, and that makes sense because we know he was a scribe. He is here shown with his implements and tools for writing. So it's a way to just kind of talk about his profession. These differences really separate this work from the others that we've seen so far and show how class can definitely affect the expectations for the figural representation in Egypt. Class can affect even the materials that are used, right? This is limestone and it's painted. His eyes are inlaid with crystal and magnesite. The nipples have an inlay of like little wooden dowels that have been inserted for that little detail on the body. This is all indicative of those class differences. He also is a little bit more individualized than some of the other representations that we've seen. When we look at his face, we get a little bit of a sense of we can maybe recognize him. It's not incredibly detailed. It's not incredibly lifelike, but it is more so than the other representations we've seen from Egypt. Part of that is due to he's got thinner lips. He's got kind of a distinct nose. You can get a feel for his square jaw and his high cheekbones. And especially what is so fantastic are his eyes. We mentioned before that they're inlaid. So they have been inlaid, and then they've got like a little copper lining around them. And then they've also had a hole drilled in the back of the stone that is used for his irises and his pupils. So you get that drilled hole. It makes it look like an actual pupil. So that's done from the back of the rock before it was inserted in. It's really wonderful, but definitely gives this work a feeling of presence, right? In addition to those aspects on his face that are a little more individualized. So while in some ways this different approach to his representation shows that he's of a lower status than the pharaoh, at the same time, this different canon really shows his job. It shows his place in society. It shows that he's made wealth from his job. He can afford this. It shows that he doesn't have to work manually, right? He's not a manual laborer. And these are all very positive statements about this individual. Here's a little note that came from a book of instruction from ancient Egypt. It says, "Become a scribe so that your limbs remain smooth and your hands soft, and you can wear white and walk like a man, standing whom even courtiers will greet." Close quote. So this scribe has a reputation as a scholar, has a reputation as someone that can walk with those courtiers, has a reputation as someone who doesn't have to work out in the fields, and it was a valued profession. So this says a lot of positive things about the seated scribe. It's really interesting to look at this representation of the seated scribe and compare it to something else that happens at about the same time period. And these are called reserve heads. They're not on your slide list. They're not something we talk about specifically in class. But in these reserve heads, which many scholars think could have been like the equivalent of a Ka statue with a funerary purpose, and of course, seated scribe had a funerary purpose as well. In these reserve heads, there are some naturalistic touches in the faces. They do feel a little specific, right? A little more individualized rather than looking so common and generic. So some scholars think they are actually meant to be portraits. Other scholars believe they're just, just a little more distinct, but that doesn't necessarily make them portraits. Let's look at one more example in this video. This is the wall relief that is painted from the tomb of T in Saqqara. This is about a 4-foot segment that we're looking at here in this image. So it's pretty large. The seated scribe was only like 21 inches tall, so it's not life-size. It almost feels like it is when you look at it, but it's a little bit smaller. This is a larger segment than what we just saw with that last example, but many tombs, remember, were decorated with murals or reliefs. These were important in the Egyptian afterlife. These were things that could provide sustenance or entertainment for the person who was deceased and entombed there. So they could look at a relief like this of T. We can see that T is hunting. We've got like a stylized pattern behind him that shows he's in the marsh with all the papyrus stalks behind him. And papyrus was a symbol of eternity for the Egyptians. We've got the hippos and fish in the water. Above, we have birds and foxes in the relief of the tree. This is something that T could do in the afterlife. Right? His spirit could animate this relief. He could enjoy this hunt, but he could also be provided for with the food obtained in this hunt. So this is something that we see quite a bit in Egyptian tombs. We have subject matter in the reliefs that could either be something that is entertainment or something that is sustenance for the deceased soul throughout the eternities. Now, T here is saying a lot of positive things about himself. He actually got his status as a hairdresser. Like, he climbs the social ladder because he's really good at doing hair, and hair was a major social class indicator in ancient Egypt. He does help also, from records we have, oversee farms and livestock, but he gets like a lot of admiration for what he does with hair. He's able to become really wealthy. He's so wealthy that he has a pretty elaborate tomb. He's got reliefs and painted reliefs on all sides of his walls, and they're very elaborate. So this says a lot about his social class. It's a little harder to see in this image, but you can see that we also have some things here that indicate to us that we're looking at Egyptian art. So before we look a little more at the subject matter and how it can be symbolic and say positive things about T, let's just look at the style here. The two things I really want to point out in this image are the registers. You can really see how we were looking at a central section. We couldn't really see the registers, but in this larger view, you can see the registers below this mural of T. You can see them to the sides as well. They love to put things in registers. It's a nice way to organize space. We also have a ton of stylization and abstraction throughout the entire representation. So as we look on these next few slides and look at all of these details, watch for the stylized elements. There's really beautiful patterns, especially for the water. Watch for the abstraction. There's not a ton of detail on anything, whether it's the animals or the figures or the muscles or the faces. That's just kind of the Egyptian approach. So T is the one who is standing in the central area. He is the one who is larger than everyone, right? So hieratic scale, showing his importance. He wants to be shown in a really positive way, and he has chosen to have himself represented according to the rules of like the very upper classes, like Pharaoh. So we have the striding pose, we have the generic yet ideal figure, right? He's got broad shoulders, narrow waist. We have a composite figure. He is idealized, even though he is generic. He's not shown with movement or emotion. These are all things that we would expect from the way the upper classes should comport themselves in art. In addition to the way the figure is shown, we have other elements that say to us we're looking at ancient Egyptian art. And actually, we should have said this earlier with the figure. We've got the canon of proportions on the grid system is more and more often being used as we're moving into this time period. And that is something that is going to allow for the figures to look really very similar from artwork to artwork over time. And we've talked a lot in class about how ancient Egypt is known for having an artistic style that lasts, right? That doesn't change really very significantly over thousands of years of time. So here's a diagram showing you how the canon of proportions on the grid system works. Generally, at this period of time, we get like an 18 block system. It's like the body is like 18 blocks tall. And that does slightly change as time goes on, but not really significantly. So you can see we've got this grid pattern that kind of overlays the body. And using that pattern, this is how many blocks the feet should be. This is how many blocks the shoulders should be. This is how many blocks the waist should be, right? Like it's got a little kind of formula to give you really calculated proportions. It makes the figures feel very stereometric. They feel very mathematically based. It makes the figures feel very controlled. They do not have a lot of movement. All of this is part of using that canon of proportions on the grid system. So when we're thinking about that lack of change in Egyptian art, we have to remember that was really very positive in the mind of ancient Egyptians. This was a society that loved control. This was a society that loved to think about eternity and continuity and how everything was going to kind of be eternal and unchanging and ordered. That was so important to them religiously. And of course, when the art continues to be eternal, unchanging, and ordered, that's really appealing to them. Now, when we look at the image, we can see some other elements that say to us we're looking at Egyptian art. Okay, so we talked about the figure. We've noted that there are registers. We can also see that there's very shallow space in these images. We don't get a lot of settings. This has more than most because we do get that stylized papyrus back there. It does have a sense of horror vacui, so there's not a lot of empty space. And if you think about the wall reliefs as a whole, being one artwork on all the walls rather than just this little section, we do see continuous narrative if you think about it in that terms. Okay, so we've got a lot of elements here that say to us ancient Egypt. But have you guys noticed yet the thing that is so unusual? And that is all of those lower class servant figures and how much movement and life and action is being shown with those figures. So T, in hieratic scale, separating himself from those lower class servants, saying he is definitely above that. And the way that they're shown in different styles definitely shows that. And the upper classes love that. They want to keep the power status. They like the status quo. They encourage the traditional artistic style because it has so many messages of how those works who are commissioned by those wealthy upper classes really have messages of showing those upper classes in a positive way with their power, with their control. All of those things are kind of meant to discourage social change in a way. So when we look down at the figures actively involved in the hunt, they are composite figures, but they're lunging, they're throwing the spears, they're in movement. It is so different from the stiffness of those idealized canonical representations of the upper classes, and instead is full of life. Okay, so T is able to make a positive statement about his class by showing himself in the way that the upper classes would be shown. But there's also positive messages about T in his participation of the hunt. So the hunt is a traditional subject matter in many cultures that is meant to show power. A lot of times you see the hunt being used for royalty or for political leaders. We've seen examples of that already. So he's kind of aligning himself with political power by showing himself at the hunt. That's the first positive message. But he's also hunting hippos specifically. Okay, now hippos, guys. Those Egyptians, they really saw the hippos. They were like agents of darkness. They're like bringers of chaos. They trampled the crops, right? So they really were ruining things for the ancient Egyptians. They didn't like hippos. And so for T to show himself hunting hippos is another really positive kind of message. The other positive message for T is that he is on a boat, and boats are often used to symbolize the journey into the afterlife in many Egyptian artworks. So this seems to suggest that T is going to be able to successfully pass all of the tests of the afterlife and travel safely, to the afterlife and achieve his eternal kind of bliss. So as we look at these two examples together, the seated scribe and then these reliefs from the tomb of T, we can understand that Egyptian artists very much approach figural representations in different ways, depending on the class status of those being shown.